Also welcome to our Zoom audience. This is my first month at American Community Media, and there's huge shoes to fill, as we all know, given Sandy's intensity and pace. But I'm glad that we're here today, and this topic cannot be more important. And the title is so fitting for this moment, No Place Left to Hide. And in July 2025, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, received a $75 billion budget on top of their base budget of $10 billion. That makes ICE the most well-funded law enforcement agency in the country. And it has gone on a spending spree. ICE has awarded major contracts to Palantir and other technology providers, getting easy access to enormous troves of data. What we're here to talk about today is what that means for immigrant communities, for civil liberties, and for the journalists trying to cover it. We will have two panels today who will look at surveillance from different vantage points. This first panel will run until 12:15. There will be a half-hour lunch break, followed by the second panel from 12:45 to 2. The event is being live streamed, and we have participants on Zoom. The first panel has three speakers, as you can all see. Ariel Ruiz, a policy analyst at Migration Policy Institute. Jacob Ward is a journalist who has covered technology and its consequences. And Juan Sebastian Pinto, who is an AI legislation advocate. And he has worked at Palantir, one of the most powerful and least understood data companies in the world. Surveillance now touches immigration, policing, housing, healthcare, and civil liberties. And most of the public doesn't know how deep it goes. Our goal today is to help journalists understand the scope and cover it better. So we will start with Ariel. And I'll ask you this first question so that we can set the broader landscape, what this means. From a policy standpoint, how would you describe the current surveillance infrastructure as it relates to immigration enforcement? And from a personal, human perspective, what does surveillance-driven enforcement actually look like for immigrant communities?
Sure. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I think this is a significant topic of interest and likely will continue to be doing so in the future. I'd like to start before I get into the more detailed conversation, and I'm happy to be joined by very, very good panelists with me so we can go into details and questions for you. Before I get into the details, I want to make sure I give you at least 5 important takeaways from what I'm about to say. The first is that though the use of technology for migration enforcement is not new, the Trump administration is doing some unprecedented steps to try to increase the reach of how data systems and interoperable operations work across government institutions. That's something that has changed in the last couple of years. Specifically, and I'm sure we're going to get to talk more about the specific components of these, but these are meant to try to increase and supercharge immigration enforcement by turning systems originally designed for counterterrorism to then become tools of mass deportation, specifically in some particular areas of previous immigration work. The second point is that new contracts and partnerships that we're seeing, not just about data, but about data sharing, are breaking down long-standing data silos so that ICE can pull information from immigration, tax, health, social services, even border databases that widen the dragnet of people who can be detected, located, profiled, and targeted for immigration enforcement across the US. The third point is that we have to acknowledge that this particular phase that we're seeing now evolve in terms of these data systems actually started post 9/11. And that's where the origins for many of these places start. A 25-year trajectory that has, in fact, increased through 287G agreements, secure communities, fusion centers, but also very common things that many of us do not think often about, like DNB records, private data brokers, creating labyrinths of data, local and commercial streams that feed into federal enforcement systems. Then, my fourth point is that even with these type of new data congregations and aggregation of sources, the enforcement payoff is not certain. So far, more data has not automatically translated into more deportations, despite the Trump administration's focus. And this is particularly because of court bottlenecks, detention capacity limits, and due process protections that I'm sure most of us will be talking about today. What it has done, it has made potential collateral effects, including chilling access for healthcare, schools, courts, and public benefits, including potentially undermining tax compliance and other core government functions. My final point, before I go into the details of this, is that the emerging surveillance architecture raises profound civil liberties and governance questions that go well beyond immigrants, not just, in particular case, not just on undocumented immigrants. Now we're beginning to see that the data that the DHS and the government are looking to do or looking to include into their data systems also includes US citizens. And that's a part that I think we need to consider to figure out how it's changing. This means that looking forward, and for the point on humanitarian movements to understand this, is we need to think about the urgent need to have legal guardrails, transparency, and democratic oversight about how the government engages in this type of operations. So those are the 5 points I think if you could take something away from today would be. But in terms of specific details that I want to try to set up the scene for my other panelists, we know that in its first year so far on the Trump administration, the administration has tried to tap into numerous federal, state, local databases in an unprecedented scale. We know that they're trying to make it interoperable. And what that means is that it's not just about simply sharing information, but about being able to communicate from one institution to another, making requests and queries about people's immigration status potentially. So it's not just like transferring an Excel file to one place. It's about being able to search through data that wasn't like that before. Some of this data includes information about US residents and citizens, including taxes, health, benefit receipts, addresses, that allow ICE and other immigration authorities to harvest, exchange, and share how this vast troves information are implemented. Palantir is certainly one of the key cases and a longtime contractor of ICE. We should know that they actually worked with them before. And they have been awarded a $30 million fund to build a streamlined database called Immigration OS to look and to aid immigration enforcement. The system is meant to have at least impact enforcement in at least 3 different ways. First, they're meant to identify removable non-citizens by looking in through AI, through Shift, through immigration records. Second, in a near real-time tracker, monitor how unauthorized or undocumented immigrants voluntarily come and move inside the United States. And third, a system that will provide immigration lifecycle management. So trying to understand how to minimize operational delays by coordinating logistical operations through detention, removal, and administrative follow-through. What type of databases is the government looking into? Some of them ones that are most important for us to cover is the DNV records that I mentioned to you before. And this is despite some states having laws that prohibit this type of sharing of data. This, in fact, allows, there are some loopholes that the administration is using to try to see how to get access to this. I mentioned the fusion data centers, which essentially integrate data mechanisms. The 287G programs, I think, are significant because it allows the government, the federal government, to look into sending information about immigrants who are under arrest or under detention, despite not having, for example, a criminal background. And just yesterday, the IRS was essentially a judge ruled against the IRS from giving ICE addresses of people who were trying to be detected by ICE. And before, 2 other courts rulings had blocked ICE from using prior information of the IRS provided in their possession. So even though that ICE has data from the IRS, they so far have been barred from using that to identify migrants. Just yesterday as well, a San Francisco judge blocked a threat to restrict state funding from federal enforcement if they did not provide names, addresses, and immigration status of individuals whose states, in those states who sought to aid the government for food and aid programs for low-income people. And that's an important aspect of it too. DHS, in addition, has sent requests to Google, Meta, and other companies to subpoena information about these users. And now we're seeing information coming down from, or trying to seek information from people's cell phones, not just the bigger databases that we would think. Finally, in terms of the databases, DHS is also buying data, and in fact, through its contractors, has already sought to increase significantly the access to that private data that they have. One key example is airline passenger travel information that ICE has used to try to, for example, find the name, address, or the itinerary of a person who's moving through the United States, and not just immigrants in this case. It is not clear, and maybe we can talk about this a bit more, I'm not an expert in this, but one of the key things that I think it's a left question open is how the government stores this type of data, under what type of systems, and what could it look like, even if it's not used for future administrations in the government. I'm just going to mention a couple, so that's the databases. I'm just going to mention a couple of the tools that we found that DHS is potentially using or seeking to use to identify migrants. For particularly phone surveillance, there's different contractors, contracts, that allow ICE to unlock people's phones, to look through people's photos, to look at text messages like Signal or WhatsApp. There's also some Paragon and other to harvest records, that mainly people's phones. And they created another app called Weblock that also uses to track people's phones information. In terms of internet surveillance, there's a different applications and contracts that allow the government to scrape social media, including post history, keyword, locations, photos, and even who people are friending in these applications. Finally, and perhaps to me the most critical component of this, is the use of street-level surveillance systems that oftentimes we do not think on our everyday lives. License plates readers, flock safety network, cameras, mobile, Fortify, and Clearview AI, to have facial recognition tools, and a bunch of other applications that are meant to track essentially how people move across their day-to-day lives. So what this means for political analysis from our part at the Migration Policy Institute is that despite all these different apparatuses, more data and information does not actually automatically lead to more arrest of non-citizens. And in fact, at times, it doesn't even go after the worst of the worst. The opportunity that the Trump administration has said from the beginning would be the key priority. In fact, more arrests, which also require more detention space, are not necessarily accompanied by increasing deportations. And in fact, the Trump administration, though they have increased arrests, have not yet surpassed deportation numbers compared to the prior Biden administration. From June through October 2025, for example, the administration arrested approximately 30 to 33,000 immigrants per month. That is a significant record, but the deportation numbers have lagged behind. The administration suggests that they've been able to deport over 630,000 immigrants so far, though we haven't been able to verify those numbers. In fact, collecting more data does not also mean better coordination. There have been instances where we know that ICE and DHS operations have relied on bad data, where people are trying to find a particular person, but in fact encounter that when they get to this address or place, it's the wrong person that they were looking for. We've seen multiple videos that I'm sure we can talk about if you have questions about it. In fact, looking forward, perhaps one of the biggest areas about who's prioritized under this data perspective is those people who are now being revoked from their liminal statuses. About 2.5 million people have lost a liminal status through the first year of the Trump administration. This includes people who had parole to come into the country, especially Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, but also humanitarian sponsorship across other parts, for example, through CBP-1 when it was in place by the Trump administration, by the Biden administration, excuse me. Now, before I conclude, the one thing that I think we need to think about looking forward is that under the One Big Beautiful Act or Bill Act, the government provided $6 billion for border technology and surveillance that could even increase how we are seeing this forward in the likelihood component. And in fact, just last year, which is not clear if it's already been implemented, but DHS introduced a rule to collect biometric data from non-citizens and note their US citizen relatives when they apply to adjust for immigration status. So it's no longer just asking for the information of the immigrant applicant, but also potentially for those who are being sponsored by them. This includes, under this rule, potential asking for facial images, iris scans, fingerprints, palm prints, voice prints, and in some cases, DNA samples. What we need to consider, and I think some people in Congress are beginning to, is to figure out how to create guidelines to provide oversight of how the government uses these type of measures. The House and the Senate, in fact, have already introduced bills to try to limit the way that immigration agencies use this data. For example, to limit the use of biometric recognition technology, another of the tools that I mentioned. Congress currently is most focused on the current shutdown of DHS, but they haven't yet brought in the technological aspect of this. The Democrats, for example, are putting significant demands of how to move forward, but technology is not one of those demands for the current shutdown. So to conclude, I think we need to be realistic about the use of technology. It is an increasingly part of our everyday life for both immigrants and US-born people. So we need to figure out ways how to make it better, more transparent and respectful of people's rights, including privacy concerns that I'm sure we're going to get into. These technologies may start with immigrants, but as we can see and have seen in the past, can expand to other populations so that they're then being used on US citizens in the future. DHS is collecting, buying, and consolidating more data than ever before, but it's unclear how well it is organized or coordinated across institutions. And that can lead to errors and mistakes that even the government should be aware about. I'll leave it there to see and ask your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Ariel. I have a follow-up question on that. Most of the surveillance expansion is occurring through contracts. And what about legislation? And in our conversation, you talked about some of the bills that are there, like, I think Ice Out of Our Faces Act. So where do you think, how does this play into this whole landscape?
Well, that's a great question. And one of the key things is, as I kind of alluded to this, is because there is not really yet a congressional record to try to have guardrails for these types of systems. Most of the contracts are more discretionary and in fact leave more doors open to try to be flexible or to expand those in the future. There's at least two bills, and there has been oversight hearings on this in Congress. They haven't received as much attention as I would have expected, but this type of bills, what they try to do is they try to set guardrails into the expanse of who is covered and for how long, especially for US citizens, and then what the storage capacity will be in the future. That's one of the things that people are not thinking about. But again, going back to this specific component, even when there are these hearings and these legislative proposals, I find it difficult that under the current Congress, either of those bills or future bills will be passed and then be signed by the president. That would be likely counterproductive from their perspective. What we can do is try to figure out what are some of the key components under those bills and try to figure out what potentially the state role could be to make some limitations and carve-outs with how they're being used. It wouldn't apply across states, unfortunately, but at least we would have some of those safeguard rails that I think are important.
And do you have any predictions on the outcomes of those efforts, where there's ongoing dispute between whether state or federal law will prevail?
It's hard to think about or to predict where they'll go. I think in California, the types of laws and cases may be a little different. But one of the things that I think is important, I didn't mention in my remarks, was that the courts are going to have a significant role in this as well, across states and across the country, because it means that at some point, and it has already happened, when there's litigation that will be ongoing and likely would head to the Supreme Court to make a final decision about how this information is used. If it gets there, even though the Supreme Court may actually vote against some of those limitations, I think it would change the narrative and the conversation that we're having. And I think that would likely be an overall positive effect.
We'll take one or two questions from the audience and from the Zoom audience too. Go for it.
Sure. It is likely that if there was a Democratic administration in the future, that they will likely roll back these type of bills or this type of contracts and access to information. We have seen that in the past. Some of the candidates haven't yet, the potential candidates haven't yet made their statement about those positions. But the bigger issue is not so much the change, is that once the system is already created, it's hard to remove that system from its existence. And in fact, the storage of it potentially would be even more difficult to try to prevent. So I think they may deprioritize, like other administrations in the past have done, the Obama administration and Biden administration, but it may not necessarily change the underlying scope of that system. And what we've known since 9/11 is that by creating the systems, you set the footprint for another administration to come. And that is why I think the bigger change has to be a congressional action on this issue. we've seen this, again, this is not a new issue. The ICE has used this type of data in other contexts under the Obama administration, the Biden administration. What is different is that now the Trump administration is seeking to do more and in ways that we haven't seen before.
You know, in immigrant communities, many families have already been giving a lot of information in schools about their kids to get health care, all of which winds up in the databases in the federal government. So can you explain to what extent that is now being folded into these databases that you're talking about? Are they able to use, is ICE able to use, and DHS able to use the information people provided, like in an emergency room, to get healthcare in order to identify where people were born, you know, what their status is, and what kind of protection can you imagine for that information, since people are scared to go and get healthcare now, or even scared to have their kids go to school, in part because that involves giving this kind of information and then how it might be used.
Right. Let me start by the end of that question. I think it's part of the tactics of the Trump administration to actually make these chilling effects that will reduce people's access to services and access to databases, because they fear their name being, for example, included in this. We've seen this even in the first Trump administration, when there was a chilling effect in people not applying for services that their children who are US citizens would be eligible for, because they would be afraid that their information would be collected as well. There are differences at the data, and maybe your colleagues know more than me about these, but at least for the healthcare systems, they tend to be more insulated from this type of data sharing agreements. It doesn't mean that they can't happen, but they could be limited. The ones that have been, and I think the IRS is a really key example. Just yesterday, what the judge ruled against the type of sharing information from the IRS, because they continue to say that, one, this information was never meant to be collected, and the people that were given the information were doing it under the standard that this was actually safe for them to do so, to increase compliance with IRS. And I think we would all agree that we want the systems to have compliance so that people pay their taxes, go to the services that they need, but also be responsible about how they're using services. That's, I think, the crux of this conversation. What systems are there? What do people know about their data protection and privacy concerns? But also, how do we make them how do we adapt to the reality that this will continue to happen? We're moving in a technology era where everything's on your phone all the time, digital wallets, everything could be, scraped in the internet for you to do that. And I think that's the key piece here, is how do we make that jump from the online invisible dragnet into the actual daily lives of people who may not know that once they fill out a form in their hospital, that could actually end in the places where they would not know.
I think, Ed, we might have to move to our next speaker, but one question.
I guess my question was about the overall impacts on public distrust in government and overall suppression of civic participation. Many census advocates are concerned now that we're 4 years away from Census 2030 about what the response to the decennial census will be. And we all believe that there'll be suppression of response from non-citizens and probably their neighbors and friends also. I'm wondering what's your sense as to whether that suppression of public engagement in civic life will persist if there is a new administration after 2028?
Look, it's a great question. I think in the end, this type of information sharing, it comes from the center. It has to be that people trust in the way that the government will use information, and that actually that would be safeguarding in the future for them. Because of the erosions that we've seen in trust in generally across the board, especially for immigrants in the country, I think you'll be, even if there was a new administration that would try to soften that difference and to build trust, it may actually take longer time and result in difficult circumstances in the short term. The census is a specific example because it is the way that the government allocates funding across the country. And if people, immigrants in particular, or people in mixed status families who have immigrants in their household, refrain from being participant in these types of surveys, it could actually not just be difficult for them, the immigrants, but also for their children, their counts in their services, lose additional assistance. And locally, that makes a significant difference, as we know, especially in small states that may not be like California with the different protections that we may have here, but specifically in more rural areas where there's less civic participation among immigrants.
Thank you, Ariel. And we'll come back to questions at the very end. Moving to Jake, Jake Ward, here on my right. You've been reporting on this topic for a while now and podcasting about it. So what pulled you into this, into looking at this so closely, and where are the guardrails that you think there are? I mean, these guardrails have been shifting too along the way. So where do you think they are today?
Well, again, thank you so much for having me. And I was very interested in what you had to say, Ariel. I'm really pleased to be here with you. So I was the editor-in-chief of Popular Science magazine once upon a time, and I remember in 2012 coming across one of a very rich vein of stories for us at that time were the various contracts being put out, offered by DARPA, the sort of incubator of the intelligence community and Defense Department, which would throw these big piles of money at anybody who could solve a problem for them. And one of the problems that they threw out was a project that they called Janus. And the Janus program was, can you take any given photograph and identify the spot from which that photograph was taken? Any photograph of anywhere, anywhere. And when you ask them about it, they're like, well, this will be for catching sex traffickers. This will be for this, that, and the other. They also were, as part of the same program, trying to figure out if you could create consistent identification of people in the background of other photographs. And you combine that with the location information, and therefore you'd be able in somebody's Instagram feed to follow a single person through the crowd shots of every single shot. And I just remember at that time being like, oh no, this is not good. And that sort of set me on the path of beginning to think about how not just the individual invasion of privacy, but then the social media amplified analysis and of people's behavior, the predictive behavior analysis, and then the even shaping of behavior, either through the chilling effects that Ariel has described so well, or through the direct efforts to change behavior for commercial purposes. And so the social media era became the kind of cooker of that worry for me, as you began to see commercial enterprises like Instagram doing these, the 10-year challenge, where upload a shot of you 10 years ago, a cute baby photo, and then one of you now. And turns out that's an amazing way to create consistency and identification of faces over time, even as they age, because persistency over the course of a lifespan is one of the hardest things to do in facial recognition. But they've solved that for the most part, in part because we fed them all the information that needed to happen. Not to blame anybody here, but it was considered cute and fun to do that. And now we live in a world in which people are like actually buying listening devices from these companies and putting them into their homes. I've learned that I can't speak on the radio or television and say the name of the listening device that Amazon sells, because they're flooded with complaints from viewers who say, stop saying the name, you're setting off my Alexa. It's become a thing that tech journalists know not to say that into the mic. And so we suddenly have created this panopticon reservoir, or a reservoir of data that makes the panopticon possible. And so that's how we so quickly got to a world in which the intelligence community, because they looked at this and recognized, wow, we're getting more than we could ever have hoped for in a million years. A Stasi intelligence chief could never have imagined a world in which we actually paid money to put a mic in our house. And yet that's the world we live in. And so for me, there was all of that as the background. And then I remember having a pair of conversations with two different tech executives during my time at NBC News most recently. One was with Wonton Tat, who's the creator of Clearview AI, which is this all-in-one facial recognition system that uses everything that we've just talked about to take any photograph of you and compare it to all other available public photographs of you and get a shot of you, no problem. Get identifying information of you, no problem. And I asked him at the time that it had come out, because of the good reporting out of the New York Times by Kashmir Hill, that this thing existed and was being used widely by law enforcement. I asked him, why do you think that human beings, that, or at least that American citizens, have given you permission for this? How is it that an American who has uploaded a photo of their child is being informed of the fact that that will from now on be available to law enforcement to track your kid for the rest of their lives? And he said to me, well, I believe that when you upload a thing to social media, you are giving up your right to privacy. You know that. And I thought, no, we don't. Nobody knew that. The whole concept of social media was supposed to be this little incubator of connection and family. So the nihilism of that was an amazing conversation. And then I had an interview with the CEO and creator of a company called Anduril, which is the companion, it's sort of the hardware version of, there's Palantir and Anduril. They're both named for Tolkien, for Lord of the Rings tropes. And Palmer Luckey, that CEO, builds these systems that are combined things like, I've gone to his Southern California headquarters to see a system called Lattice that he was building. This was pre-COVID, for the border, where it combined drone technology and very, very incredible long distance camera technology that could do facial recognition and persistence of gaze, so that you could follow somebody even in the dark along the border for hundreds and hundreds of miles, without them knowing that the drone was even there. They had designed them to fly especially silently. They were really amazing. And I said to him, you've invented this entirely new category of technology. Is it your responsibility to also invent some of the ethics that come with this technology? And his answer was, I'm more of a technology guy than a policy guy. And I believe that democracy is going to take care of that. It's not up to me. I just make the tools, and democracy will show us what is or is not acceptable in the use of those tools. But it's not my job to get out in front of that. Well, we now live in a world in which the involvement of government in technology is not adding any guardrails. In fact, it is demanding that they be removed. And so today, literally today, at 5 o'clock is the deadline by which the Pentagon is holding the AI company Anthropic to the need to turn over a guardrail-less version of its technology to them. And Anthropic's CEO and co-founder Dario Amodei has said, we won't comply because of two bright red lines that he says that the company has drawn. One, we won't allow mass surveillance of Americans. And two, we won't allow our technology to be used to create an automated kill chain that doesn't involve human consultation before killing somebody. And I would argue, first of all, those are extremely low standards for ethical use of AI, considering the incredible range of things that it can be used for without crossing those red lines. But those are literally the only red lines there are. We have no federal data privacy laws. We have no federal data transparency laws. And now we're in a regime where no one is imposing any sort of democratic guardrails. So my biggest complaint always with the tech industry that I've covered for so long is that there are no democratic inputs. And in this case, it is, and the industry has always argued we should self-regulate because we are the most moral and intelligent people on these subjects anyway. That was the argument during the social media era. This is the only week in my last, I would say, 6 or 7 years that I've seen any company put in any kind of standards for themselves. And so that's the one CEO I've ever seen say, actually, you know what, it is my job to get out in front of this stuff, at least a little. And I would argue it's not enough. And I'm sure we're going to hear from one the way in which it is not enough. So as to the state of the art, it's just important to know that like none of the old rules apply. I just did a report yesterday that detailed I just literally did a random smattering of the things that AI makes possible currently, that these pattern recognition technologies make possible. So there are already systems, there's one deployed by the special forces that can identify your heartbeat from 200 yards out using a laser. And it turns out that your heartbeat is so distinct to you that it is in fact more accurate and more accurate over time than facial recognition. It's 98% accuracy. And you can't leave your heart at home. You can't cover it with a mask, right? There's no changing it. There's literally nothing you can do to avoid being identified in that way. There is also now technology that will triangulate your position using the Wi-Fi routers in your house. So this is another case in which it is technology infrastructure that you have installed and never realized you were installing this kind of technology that makes it possible for somebody to triangulate your position and create essentially a live video feed, a wireframe video feed of where you are in your house from a van sitting outside your house, no warrant required. There's a new technology that allows the use of Wi-Fi signals and extremely sensitive cameras to read lips through a mask. You no longer need, you can't even cover your own mouth to hide what you are saying if you're covered by a cloth mask. So none of that, I would argue, falls onto the, you know, the far side of the bright red lines that Anthropic has thrown in here. But I think we would all agree, and in theory, in any speech, a politician would say that that's unacceptable. But again, there are no guidelines around that whatsoever. There are no democratic inputs around it whatsoever. And we're down to a world in which the PR strategy of a company and maybe the deeply held principles of one or two of its executives are all that stands between us and some really scary stuff, you know. I could go on and on, but I'm going to let you get in.
You know, I'd like you to go on and on, but I have a quick follow-up question. About 5 years ago, you broke the story about a person being wrongly identified on facial recognition software.
Yeah.
We've come a long way since then. But do you think these kinds of things continue to happen?
So the one really complicated thing about the coverage that I do is that I think it's very easy to get focused on the way that the limitations of a technology feed into the way in which it violates people's civil rights. So in this case, in the early stages of the use of law enforcement, the use of facial recognition by law enforcement through tools like Clearview, it is not as good at identifying Black and brown faces as it is and female faces as it is identifying faces that look like mine. And so on the one hand, the narrative at that time, and I put this on the Today Show, was here is this guy in Detroit who was wrongly grabbed for a jewelry theft that he did not commit, and he spent 2 nights in jail as a result. And that is problematic already. But it is, I would argue, but today, the fidelity of facial recognition is vastly better. And one would be tempted to say, oh, well, that's a relief. Thank goodness. The problem is that, as all of these companies put it, law enforcement is not supposed to rely solely on the technology for identification. It's not supposed to replace conventional investigation techniques or the burden of proof that's supposed to land on law enforcement. But they use it that way all the time because it is so much simpler, in the same way that we are using ChatGPT and Claude and the rest to write our wedding vows and our knock jokes and our emails to, you know, our cold call emails. Law enforcement they are only human in the same way. And so they are very tempted to do this. And you will see we did another story about another man grabbed by facial recognition, a guy named Derek Ingram, who was arrested after being at a No King's Day protest. He shouted through a bullhorn at a cop point blank range, and they came for him at his apartment a couple of days later, basically in revenge. It was the NYPD kind of came to him to avenge the hearing of this officer who had been, I guess, affected. And the footage that we had at the time showed the Clearview AI printout that had his face, and here's where he lives, and and it literally says at the top of it, not to be used for suspect identification. You're not, in theory, allowed to use this to identify the person. You have to go through these other means. But now we've seen, not only are they, of course, relying on that because it's easier than writing a cold email or a knock joke or anything else, they're also inventing legal strategies for using this technology to provide the evidence they require in court without admitting that they used it. So there are these systems that were pioneered around informants called parallel prosecution, in which you are secretly following somebody throughout their life using, in the old days, an informant, but now facial recognition. And then you use a parallel prosecution for a broken traffic light or whatever it is, broken turn signal or whatever it is, to grab that person and prosecute them without ever having to mention that you put them into this panopticon. So I would just say, anytime you hear anybody say, and this is true of AI in general, like, oh, well, it's not good enough yet at this, and that's its flaw, I would invite everybody to think about how in 2 financial quarters, they're going to have ironed that out. That won't be, the technical limitations won't be the issue. And instead, it is the way in which they are being implemented by people who are only human and only lazy as a result. And that is where the civil rights are going to get eroded just as much as, mistakenly identifying somebody. They're going to grab who they mean to grab more and more using this technology. So.
Sunita?
Jake, I wanted to ask about social media, which you had mentioned, and you had said that, we had essentially given up our privacy rights. As we grow towards becoming influencers, say, for example, we are throwing our information out to random people in order to go viral, etc. What would you say about that? Have we willingly given up our privacy rights? And what guardrails exist in social media to protect us from many of the things that you just discussed?
Well, I would say that for all of us working journalists in this room, I think the expectation of privacy is much lower. I just think we would all agree that we are not your average person putting their baby photos up. I don't put any photos of my kids on. I've excised all photos of my children from the internet. We've just seen with this horrific kidnapping of Savannah Guthrie's mother. It is a very sensitive thing to be a public figure speaking on anything that people care about. And so I would just argue that all of us should treat your social media in the same way that you would treat any written byline. Don't be casually posting anything, would be my suggestion. I would say that's distinct from what I've been talking about sort of en masse, in that our giving over of our information to these for-profit institutions with no regulations and no responsibility to be transparent about how they use them is teaching us. And again, I'm eager to hear from Juan, because he'll tell us all about how fucked up that is and how dangerous it is that they all have that. One person that I think about, there's 2 people that I think about a lot in this conversation that I feel like haunt this conversation for me. And one is Meredith Whittaker, who, if nobody knows, is somebody you should be following every day if you can, who's the president of Signal, the messaging app that's a competitor to Facebook's WhatsApp, to Meta's WhatsApp. And she came out of Google and quit that place as an early AI researcher because she recognized that this huge database of information was being used to manipulate people and track them. She could see the rise of the AI tools that was going to make it vanishingly easy to manipulate people and use and track them. And she has created Signal essentially as a fight against that, such that the data that they collect as a company never goes into the panopticon. And she's very brave, especially women in that world are so much braver than I ever have to be. And she speaks very forcefully and wonderfully about that. So I recommend her. And then the other one I think about is, you'll hear, I think, a lot of arguments from the tech sector that the way they do things is the only way to do it. You hear this a lot, for instance, in this, the justification of the incredible money they are spending on infrastructure, the $1 trillion, and all of the climate damage that they're going to do in building the data centers that are going to continue to power this revolution. You look at that as compared to what China is doing, where they are building, I'm not in any way here to defend China's use of AI, but their way of building it is so cost effective, so much less damaging to the climate, and uses chips that you don't have to blow all this money on. We don't have to do it this particular way. And in the same way, I would argue, even though these companies try to say, well, you have to do it this particular way. And the Trump administration has argued, well, of course you would want everything in one big bucket. It's just going to make for better government. And Ariel has described that bucket so well. I also think about a guy named Thomas Ilves, who's the president of Estonia. He was the president of Estonia. And when Estonia first became a democratic country after it threw off Soviet control, they were building a digital system for themselves. And they looked at this exact problem. They saw this problem in advance, and they said, we're going to create a all-in-one digital experience for our citizens. So in Estonia, you can pay your taxes in like 90 seconds on your phone. You vote on your phone. It's an incredible digital interface kind of society. But as he described it, the architecture of it is like a Christmas tree. Each of the ornaments is a separate database from your life, your legal life, your health records, your bank records. Those can all talk to one another when you ask them to. You can go and get all of that information, but no one of those ornaments can talk to any of the others. And it's so much, just whenever I hear people say, well, of course you would do it this way. And in the case of a panopticon, a federal panopticon, of course you would throw it all into a bucket. I just keep having to remind myself, there are so many other ways to do this, and we can be so much smarter than this. And so that's what I'm thinking about.
There are some questions from on Zoom, from our Zoom audience. So Lee.
This comes from Aitana Vargas, and they're asking about DNA data, and is it possible for agencies to collect some of these DNA data?
Oh, that's a really good question. I have a whole, and I shouldn't jump in here. I'm just the one who's been most recently speaking. I don't know a huge amount of it. I know there's an enormous burgeoning world of predictive analysis being done on DNA, because these guys want to live forever and want to make their babies better. I had a big piece in the New York Times back in 2018, sort of predicting that. And then just recently that has really become a commercial product. The degree to which one can grab DNA data and follow somebody around, in my experience, has been very limited on the part of law enforcement, because they're just not very good at that. They don't have the labs to do that. You know anything different about that? No, I don't know anything about the DNA collection from the law enforcement perspective.
I know the DHS has been seeking to collect DNA information about migrant children. So it is actively happening today. Yeah.
It's going to get so much darker when we get to Juan, this conversation, to see.
Hi, my name is Ankita. I'm a reporter with India Currents. So first of all, first part is a bit of some frustration at my end, and then I'll get to my question. So it's funny that we talk about China and Saudi Arabia being surveillance states when we are pretty much picking up pages from their book, or maybe they're inspired from us. I don't know how it's going right now, who is on whose side. But I want to understand journalism, especially digital media, is so completely dependent on web browsers, people looking for us, social media, Apple News, Google News. If we switch off completely from our devices and we just turn off everything, where is journalism going to head? We're already in a very, very dark space in terms of making the business viable. And we have to be, but if people are surveilling me for looking up stuff, like when the Epstein files came out, everybody around me was looking up stuff on the internet, right? You can't stop scrolling. You can't stop looking at stuff because it's just so much information thrown at you at once. And I mean, as journalists, we know when to stop, but a lot, I mean, my husband's a software engineer. He doesn't know when to stop, right? He's doom scrolling. So that's the first question. The second one is, how much of an opinion can journalists have before the government turns up at our doorstep? Because right now it's sort of giving me the feeling, how much can we say before it's too much?
These are wonderful questions. If we solve these questions here today, we will have really done something. I think the first thing I would say on the business model, I applied to be the dean of the UC Berkeley Journalism School. I did not get that job, because I came into that conversation and I was like, I don't know, like, what would I tell a kid who wants to study journalism? What could I really, in good faith, tell a kid to put $60,000 into this business? I'm not sure I could. And so as a result, I didn't even get out of the "Are you crazy?" round of that. So my idea about the business viability of it is as limited as a working journalist's perspective always is, right? On the other hand, the tools are incredible and are about to get really incredible. And I have a couple of working groups that I've been part of, thinking about how one could not only parse the Epstein files really quickly, something like the Epstein files really quickly, But my dream is that as we all are working in a sort of more and more independent sense, that a coordinating technology could in some way act like the news desk and say, Sunita, you're going to do this and you're going to do this and I'm going to do the economic angle and get us coordinated. Because one of the problems that we have right now in the Substack world is everybody's doing the same story each day, rather than everybody getting coordinated across it and surrounding a story the way we are trained to. So I'm looking forward to that turn of the wheel digitally, and I think that could make a big difference. How we get paid for that, I'm not, again, I don't know the answer to that. And then as to your question about perspective, you know, I think what we have all watched is that there is a very powerful shift going on toward perspective that is giving, you know, I've learned that, so I'm part of a cohort of sort of informal cohort of creators, many of whom have sort of wound up in the role of journalism simply because they started to mouth off about politics on their cooking channel. And they have like millions and millions and millions of followers. And in that Slack group recently, somebody asked, hey, I'm getting leaked these documents from the Pentagon and I don't know how to verify them. Does anyone have any online journalism like crash courses I could take? And I like whacked my head against the keyboard a couple of times, right? Because, and I don't blame that person, it is because they have an enormous following, vastly greater following than I, who poured my life into this job, has or probably will ever have. But there's clearly a gathering around personalities thing that is happening now that if we're going to survive, we're going to have to accommodate in some form. And so I am in this weird moment where I am no longer representing a single newsroom. So I don't get to be, it was such a comfortable posture once upon a time not to have an opinion in public. And now I'm sort of being called upon to do so. And so I'm trying to learn this language of saying, I have done this long enough that I have this perspective on this thing that I'm about to tell you about. And I don't know yet whether I'm doing that well or right, but I do know that I'm reaching far more people now doing that than I ever did before. And so I by no means am here saying we should all be doing that and it's good that we're moving that direction. I don't feel that way. But there's an accommodation that's going to have to be reached around that I think we're all going to have to figure out together. It's a weak answer, but that's what I got.
We're running short on time, so we'll move to our next speaker, Juan Sebastian. Walk us through how you became an anti-surveillance evangelist. You worked at Palantir, one of the companies at the center of many of these conversations. What did you do there? And why did you leave? And how would you describe the gap between how the company presents its tools and what those tools actually do?
Yeah, I was just talking to Jake a little while earlier about my experience at Palantir. And one of the most important things I found out, I'm an English major, I'm a writer and a designer by trade. I'm not an engineer, but I worked on explaining these systems to people at the Pentagon, to commercial clients. And I think that experience helped me really realize where the lies were. You know, if you're an engineer, you work on the tools, you might not look outside for context. You might not have sort of the humanities background to understand the intersectional impacts of the technology you're building. But at Palantir, I really got in touch with that kind of world of narrative building and deception that a lot of AI companies participate in today in order to convince you that these technologies are inevitable, that they are needed, that we absolutely need to continue funding this exploitative AI ecosystem that exists today. I think we've established with these incredible speakers some really important points today. And the first one is how sticky these platforms are and how they enable policing departments, law enforcement agencies, and militaries to change their behavior without democratic oversight. So that's one of the main problems here. And on the other side, when we look at the tech companies, we realize how willing they are to use the Nuremberg defense to support and continue their work for the government. That means saying, my boss told me to do this. You know, I don't have any moral responsibility. I rely on policy and on this administration to make the ethical decisions about how these technologies are built. And recently we saw ICE, we saw a whistleblower at ICE, Ryan Schwenk, this week come out and reveal that on the first day he was told to teach new recruits to violate the Constitution. So we're working with an agency that is, blatantly unconstitutional, which is developing AI software with millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars at its disposal. When I talk to journalists, I beg them to consider the work of Jacques Ellul, which is a social critical theorist. And his way of looking at technology, I think, is very important if we want this perspective that considers, humanitarian aspects of technology. He says you don't only have to take into account the technology, the raw engineering power and tools and mechanisms, but you also have to take a look at the technique of technology. That means how it's applied in the real world, how it's sold, how it's promoted, how it takes over systems, how it influences behavior, and how it challenges democracy. Today, we have to look at Palantir and all these companies in that light. We can't trust everything they say. We have to test and challenge the contract language. We have to test and challenge the policy language as well, or we won't get anywhere. Because right now, the media ecosystem and the tech ecosystem is often convinced that Palantir and these companies are just simple, sanitized data integrators. But in reality, when we look at the technique of Palantir and these software, we realize that they come originally from targeting technologies used in the military. The way that Palantir builds social graphs and targeting mechanisms, these were developed, Project Maven, these were developed with intelligence agencies, and Palantir is a specialist at counterinsurgency, So now we see Palantir's platforms in America being used to sort of perform counterinsurgency tactics on American protesters, on migrants. This includes using technology that actually echoes the horrible, horrible, horrible technologies we saw in Gaza, where civilians were followed to their homes for targeting. We see the same things happening in the United States with software platforms like Elite, leading to the direct, search of people on their homes, targeting of their information on social media, and the outright and wholesale violation of the Fourth Amendment. So another important thing that I think has been said here, and thank you, Jake, for mentioning it, is that although all of us here are men, I really truly believe that this movement against these surveillance companies is being led by women. Yes. And that is not only like people like Sarah Whitaker, but women at the AI Now Institute, reporters like Carol Cadwallader, who have been challenging Palantir for forever. She broke the story of Cambridge Analytica, but also like tons, literally hundreds of researchers across the world in universities, people like Sophia Goodfriend, who's been on the ground in Gaza, questioning IDF officers and figuring out how these technology systems work. I truly believe that if we're to fight sort of this bro oligarchy of men that are exploiting our data and making us believe that there's only one direction we can take these AI technologies in, they need to be challenged, and we need to put attention to all those women that are also doing this amazing work.
So Ariel mentioned a couple of times the idea of storage. And I think Palantir has control of that. I mean, in terms of creating a searchable database, I think, with their OS. How sophisticated do you think it is today? And I know that it's a developing technology too. I mean, it's only going to get better.
Yeah, the question of storage and where Palantir plays a part is really important because there's a lot of misconceptions about how the company operates and also about how data is shared and exploited by AI companies. So a lot of people think that Palantir collects data and integrates that data itself, but it actually does it for its clients, for its government clients. And, while in principle, the government gets to keep its data and it's supposed to be secure, what a lot of AI companies do is they train on data for their clients and their models improve because of that training data. So while these companies might not be able to keep your information and store this information for other people to use, they're able to develop, for example, a use case of AI technology that is used in the military based on information collected from the military. And even if they don't get to keep that information, they can then sell the models or sell the use cases to commercial companies. So what I often say to people is, a lot of people are concerned about, why should I be worried about my data being, searched? I'm a law-abiding citizen. Well, I would tell them, AI companies don't necessarily want your specific information. In fact, they often anonymize it when they're learning about your information or training their models. but they want to learn about everyone who is like you, everyone who shares your characteristics and can behave like you in the future. So these models, while they may not be able to, keep and hold the data they collect because of limitations and policy, they're able to be trained on anonymized data and therefore be used, in a dual use capacity, not only in the military, but in civilian context as well.
So let's talk about Anthropic. Last question. I think this is an important topic, and Jake mentioned it. And you have had some experience when you worked at Palantir. And yesterday, Jake wrote a piece about the guardrail, giving up the whole Anthropic is pushing back against a guardrail, giving up a guardrail-free technology to the government. So give us your, background in this, on this topic. And
yeah, I've been a critic of Anthropic for most of the year, specifically because Anthropic's collaboration with Palantir was one of the main reasons I started speaking out against these companies. When I worked at Palantir, I helped sell and brand the tools that companies like Anthropic, Google, OpenAI use to access federal contracts and classified networks. So I worked in Palantir FedStart, which is, helps these companies get accredited fast and go after federal contracts. So after Doge happened, what I saw was all these companies taking advantage of the situation of thousands of federal employees being fired in order to work with Palantir to push their AI systems across the government. Anthropic made its bed with Palantir, and now it's one of the first AI tools, generative AI tools, to have access to classified information systems. And this is exactly the kind of debate that I believe was going to follow. My argument is this is the most important debate of our time. Anthropic has been fear-mongering about labor loss. It has been fear-mongering about superintelligence forever. But to me, it has participated, like a lot of other companies, in kind of occluding this main issue. And now it's being forced to confront it. There's a 5 p.m. deadline today. And Dario Amodei, like Jake said, wrote, a defense of his position. But he said, we will only set the line at fully autonomous AI weapon systems. But there are so many more ways in which the government and militaries are able to exploit data with artificial intelligence. In fact, that way of exploiting data with artificial intelligence, the way it looks like today, people don't even recognize as warfare. It involves targeting people based on their personal information. It involves carrying out covert, secretive tactics. It involves running social media disinformation campaigns. There's so many ways in which AI is used that sits outside fully autonomous weapon systems that immediately endanger everyone here. And that includes sort of the integration of our government data, the targeting of people at their homes, and the violation of the Fourth Amendment.
Thank you. Questions? Hugo.
What technology have been used by what technology may have been used to catch El Mencho in Mexico? Because according to news reports, it was the U.S. who supplied the exact location, as he ran through the forest to hide. So I just wondered that. And then the other question I have is, so what countries are implementing, the most, aggressive, to violate the privacy of their citizens? And I'm thinking about Gaza, Israel, but I may be wrong. So how is that being implemented? What countries?
Yeah, I can't comment on specific operations that I don't know too much about, but I can tell you exactly what technology was likely used, what sort of development leads to the arrest of people like that or of Maduro. And that's life pattern analysis, right? That's some of the core technologies that Palantir was able to create. Social graphing people's relationships. All of Palantir's technologies emerged from that study of an individual and the events in their life, the people they know, all the attributes that make them who they are. Now, for example, understanding that, you realize why it's so dangerous, for example, that the DHS right now is looking to access all of Americans' big tech third-party data and find a platform to help it exploit that data. Because everyone here throughout their lives has been sort of slowly drip feeding information about themselves on the internet, on apps, every single piece about them, their location information, biometrics, health information, financial information, slowly getting compiled over time and accessed by these agencies is extremely dangerous. And what they're doing, right, is fundamentally, whether it's to catch, people like you just mentioned, or Hugo Chavez, or migrants in the United States, it's building life pattern analysis of these people so they can catch them when they are. For example, with Palantir's Elite tool, which is supposed to deliver probability of somebody being in their home based on that sort of life pattern analysis. So fundamentally, I think when we think about AI, a lot of us think, about productivity, efficiency. I think in practice, as someone who worked inside these systems, selling these systems, AI usually stands for increased surveillance and monitoring of employees, customers, and targets. And it allows for this exploitation of their personal lives.
I would just throw into, you were asking what other countries might be violating people's privacy. So your readers might be interested to look at the smart cities program that China has piloted, which is really worth following around, because China has done a very aggressive job of creating an all-in-one panopticon like we are worrying about here, productizing it and exporting it. So there's more than 700 cities around the world that have bought this product, including Rio, Quito, Ecuador, Karachi, Pakistan, Lagos, Nigeria, big capital cities. And it integrates your subway card, your phone, where you paid for your snacks, all of that into an all-in-one system so that the local law enforcement knows where you are at any given moment. So just so we're not deluding ourselves that the United States is somehow the worst offender in this, we are a bad offender and we're getting worse. But this is being exported en masse by China, and as Juan so well put it, it's sticky in a way that these countries love and are getting pulled into. So Europe is the only place left that is not falling down that rabbit hole, I would say.
And I just want to address, you mentioned Gaza, and that's exactly where all these companies and have been testing a lot of these systems. I got a call from a journalist in Israel just a few weeks ago, and it was a really sad call. He's been covering this for decades, and he really sees Gaza as the lab for all these technologies where a lot of these tools were tested. And as I mentioned before, Palantir, the commercial operator, might not have access to the data it collected in Gaza, but it very much could have access to models trained in Gaza or to use cases developed in Gaza. And if you look at Palantir now, it has an active desk at the humanitarian aid operation in Gaza today. So Palantir was not only involved in the politics of who gets to die in Gaza, but it's now involved in the politics of who gets to live in Gaza. And I think that really, really, emphasizes the problem with these technologies. They're involved in sort of this biopolitics, deciding who deserves to live, and necropolitics, who deserves to die, and giving so much power to private companies that, for example, threaten their critics with drones to make those decisions in black boxes. And I also want to mention something that is really scary to me that goes even beyond this, and that's that Palantir is not only using its tools on the ground in order to arrest people, in order to kill people in foreign places, right? But here in the United States, it's also being used by the government to go after ideological, targets, and for example, in Minneapolis, Palantir is being used to investigate fraud, but Palantir is also being used by the HHS to police its DEI projects, so it's been directly used to cancel contracts, to fire employees involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion operations. And if you really think about AI and what would make a responsible AI system, it would be an AI system that accounts for equity, equality, diversity, inclusion of all its stakeholders. Palantir is actively undermining all these principles by working with the government to push its ideology, eliminating these considerations from governance. So how could you expect the company to be responsible when it's actively, for example, enforcing ideological gender, acts from and executive orders from the government, when it's actively enforcing these political programs?
Take one last question from the Zoom audience.
Hi, this is from Nicole Chang and Ariel Ruiz Soto. Perhaps you can help answer. There are concerns that various types of government data, including social security numbers, Medicare, and Medicaid, are being used in ICE enforcement actions. What categories of data do you think could potentially be shared with ICE in the future?
Sure. So one of the key components that we've seen increasing over time is starting with addresses or people's their locations more. It's kind of like what the other panelists are saying. It's basically trying to figure out if they have a target to try to query where they could be and where they could be, for example, intercepted in the street or somewhere else. But I think in the future, likely what we're seeing indications of now is actually going farther than that. It's not just where they live, but who they're with or who they may know, what they may be applying for, and potentially where they could potentially essentially execute a order or in the terms of administration, find fraudulent claims toward benefits that would disqualify someone for a benefit in the future. That's a type of future-looking components that may actually be more, that may have more longer-term effects than just knowing somebody's address and trying to go after one person that would do that. I think ICE in the past, through its investigations operations, we're looking at one person, we're trying to go after them. They had a removal order, they were trying to execute that order. Now it's much more about that. It's not just one individual, but the casting that bigger net to try to catch more people who potentially be here without status and to potentially deport them.
You want to, Selene?
About the city itself and the people in it in the age of AI. Is this thing on? And it made me think of two questions. In one, he describes a sort of a fork in the road among the people building this stuff as to this original hypothesis that by 2027, you know, the AI would be good enough that it can basically improve itself recursively. I'm wondering what the thought is among the people on the ground that you've worked with as to whether we'll get to a point where this surveillance technology will move to some sort of governance that doesn't need human.
Well, yeah, I think I've actually dedicated a lot of time to kind of think about these doomsday scenarios and how they might be misleading people. So I often, when I look at, you know, the question of superintelligence or of labor replacement, I see it as a sort of distraction for things that are happening already today, which is people are actively getting deported, they're losing their rights, they're getting killed using artificial intelligence technologies. But this is a very small part of the conversation around AI. And I think that's by design. Yeah, I think, you know, Sam Chris, I haven't read the article yet, but I know his work, he's really amazing. Emphasize, like, that's exactly why we need writers to help people visualize and understand these oppressive structures. That's why I consider these literal architectures of software platforms, but they're architectures that people can't engage with because they can't see them. But throughout their lives, they will end up altering their behavior, their outcomes, and the outcomes of the people and communities around them. So I think we all need to work on kind of like explaining these things to people, finding creative ways to represent these systems to people. I have a friend that's not very knowledgeable about AI, but he said something really smart when I explained to him the idea of superintelligence. He said, I think, how will that look like when superintelligence takes over? And it really got me thinking. And he said, I think we won't know what it looks like because we won't understand it. It will happen slowly and we won't be able to see it or really understand it because it's smarter than us, because it's so advanced. So in a way, if we want to prevent those outcomes, there's so many scenarios in which, Jake was just talking about, like, imagine one person companies, what kind of wealth inequality will that create? When one person's making billions of dollars. There's so many scenarios like that. But the fact is that we don't understand the steps to get there. So the biggest responsibility for journalists and for anyone working in AI is to help educate. And this has been kind of the position of some of the greatest AI educators in the past as well.
Another quick one. There's also this dynamic described in that piece, like a perverted or reverse arms race, where as the technology gets more sinister, rather than most people jumping on the guardrail bandwagon, they say, well, I know how to develop this, the best, so that nobody else can use it for their own purposes. Somewhat adjacent, how optimistic are you about grassroots, like Pause AI Now movements as opposed to congressional level guardrails.
Do you have some thoughts here?
I would just throw in, like, we still are in a world in which these companies require idealistic young people to make the products. So as Anthropic was weighing whether or not to comply with this Pentagon deadline, and they have decided not to, the concern was that the other three companies that are in line behind them that came up through the Fed Start program that Juan has spoken about so bravely, that they would come in and do what Anthropic was not willing to do. We'll see, but 200 employees of both Google and OpenAI have just signed this big letter that started circulating yesterday saying we won't be part of this either, and trying to say we will, we'll do this. The problem, as one points out, is there is this vision, this dream. Sam Altman talked about it in a podcast with Alexis Ohanian in 2024, January 2024, where he said, wouldn't it be awesome if we have $1 billion one-person company, and that he and his tech CEO friends have a bet going as to when that's going to happen. And at that point, you don't need your young people to anymore. And as a result, you don't have to listen to them when you, so I do worry about ethical isolation and that getting worse as these every time you read about the companies getting smaller and more nimble, one side effect of that is that there's less democratic process going on inside of that company. So I worry about that part of it. I would say, I think that their power is going to get worse in that way, which is why we're going to need a great either presidential candidate or a great congressperson who really articulates this stuff and gets a groundswell around it. Andrew Yang tried to be that guy and it didn't work, but someone's going to nail this, I think, politically, and I hope and dream that that's going to make some difference going forward. But
well, with that, I think we'll one last question. Okay,
journalist.
One who knows Tolkien will know that the Palantir was the spheres that were used to sort of by the Dark Lord to control the world, essentially. So I don't know if the naming of Palantir was ironic or what.
They're always grabbing these dark sci-fi and fantasy tropes and doing creepy things with them. I don't know why. They're always naming their stuff after weird things like that.
Yeah, it should have been a signal.
Right.
My son, who's 21, it will be turning 21 in a few days, has asked me for a flip phone. I'm wondering if you've seen any sort of emergence of young people just turning away, because everything you're talking about rests on our acceptance of it, of our buy-in. And I'm curious if you see any sort of emerging rejection of this. And then my final question is, I worked for many years in the climate space. Nobody cares about climate anymore. I think the doom sort of message just wore people out, and nobody ever saw the doom coming. What, you were alluding to this a moment ago. But what is the message here in a way? How do we deliver the message without sort of falling into the same trap that the climate folks fell into?
Maybe we could ask each of you to answer that question, and then we'll have to end this session and open it up for one-on-one interviews and a bite to eat before we resume at about 10 to 1.
Combining that question with the one that we had earlier about whether there's any hope. I think there is hope at the state level. There's a lot of, legislation in Colorado, for example, addressing third-party data, addressing pricing surveillance, AI regulation and discrimination. And I really think these initiatives have a chance to succeed. I also think the states that lead on this will also be the lead in these technologies. I really think most of these companies will fall flat on their face because they are so irresponsible with the management of their technology and with the clients they pick. So I think before that happens, the states that regulate it stronger, that mediate the relationship humans have to this technology will win, will create the most jobs, and will be the most successful. The other aspect is, sorry, give me 1 second.
Well, you think of it, I'll just say one thing that makes me hopeful about young people is there's a great word going around called clanker. So young people are calling people who either use AI too much or referring to the AI itself as clanker. Don't be a clanker. It's great. And so that is the thing where you're like, oh, right. Young people always see this stuff well. It's our generation that was like, don't believe everything you read on the internet, kids. And then now we're like, I saw Jesus in a piece of toast on Facebook. You know, like we're all starting, we got crazy real quick. You know, it's young people who see this stuff well. And for me, I'm actually there's wonderful youth advisory groups being put together. There's wonderful work being done to pull in young people's perspective on AI. And it turns out they're seeing it so much more clearly than we are. So I'm hopeful about that. Whether that will solve any of the problems that we described here today, not in the short term, but I'm a big fan of young people.
Yeah, and that's where my biggest hope is right now is in the young people, like your child that is rejecting, you know, a smartphone, knows it's the CIA surveillance device, knows there's still a chance to get his mind back. I think we're talking about journalism and literacy. You know, I think like paywalls have been a big reason why people don't understand what's going on right now in the world. You know, they rely on shorter formats, you know, and if we don't recognize that, you know, our, you know, completely damaged attention collectively is also preventing us from taking action, understanding these systems and addressing these problems. If we don't understand that our lack of attention is also fed by these algorithms that exploit our behavior, keep us hooked to these systems. And if we don't address our personal behaviors and how they have shaped our entire world today, how they have led to apathy, to hopelessness, to loneliness, if we don't realize how these commercial AI models work in similar ways to these military AI models and kind of, you know, connect with each other again, gain a better understanding of these systems and challenge them, then there is actually no hope, you know? So I really rely on people, young people. There's the Luddite movement across the country, Lamb Club in New York. There's the Attention Revolution movement in Brooklyn. There's so many groups right now, abstinence.
So I'm gonna cut you off just to let Ariel have the last word on this because we're running out of time.
Sure, I'll be brief. I think from a research perspective, what we can think would be more of the hopeful looking forward side of this is looking to see how the systems, as explained in the test case scenario of immigration, continue to be more transparent, and in which cases, I think the state level perspective is a good one. They actually improve the way that we continue to look at immigration. I think enforcement, regardless of who wins the next election in the White House, will continue to use technology. I think it's about trying to figure out how the technology helps be transparent and ways that actually makes it seem like it's effective in trying to go after what the government or the United States thinks is a priority, but also considers more specifically the conditions that actually make those still safeguard the protections that immigrants without status actually deserve, or at least are being given under the courts. The courts, I think, will be the other aspect of this, and we'll see how they rule going forward. But the courts are actually catching a lot of this already. We'll see how it looks like. It's reactive, it's not as proactive as my colleagues have suggested, but I think it will be the way that I'll be looking for in terms of research.
That's great. Jai, I just want to say thank you so much for having orchestrated and guided us through this remarkable first panel. I definitely think people are going to want to set up times to talk with you and having a break for 15 to 20 minutes and also get a sandwich, get something to eat. We're now going to zoom into local implications of what this broader picture means with a specific emphasis on the immigration crackdown, which is where our agency sort of started this inquiry.
And trust in institutions collapse. And from an enforcement standpoint, these tools are often deployed in ways that are racially and culturally insensitive. So we have 4 panelists on this panel, and so there's a lot of ground to cover. So we're just going to jump right in and introduce our panelists. We have Rebecca Gurney, who's the Special Projects Coordinator at the East Bay Sanctuary Covenant. We have Supervisor Aaron Peskin, a former member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, Jake Snow, a senior staff attorney at ACLU, and we have Tim Redman, who is a political and investigative reporter in San Francisco. And so what we're here to talk about right now is what local activists and advocates are working on to tackle how the government uses various tools to keep an eye on us. And so, Rebecca, let's start with you. You work directly with immigrant communities, navigating the consequences of surveillance, and it's not an abstract policy issue. And so your perspective keeps this grounded in human stake. So tell us about the work you do and what is at stake.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Okay, good. Can you hear me? Yeah, so I work for East Bay Sanctuary Covenant. We are a legal and social service provider for low-income immigrants in the Bay Area. We are 43 years old. Our origin is in the sanctuary movement, and Berkeley is the first sanctuary city in the country. And so we carry the legacy of our founders and the founders of Sanctuary in Berkeley, who were faith leaders that went to detention facilities, spoke with migrants from Central America, heard about US interventions in Central America, and kind of raised the red flag, as at that point the Reagan administration was not talking about the various ways that the United States was intervening and really causing people to flee their countries and come to the United States. And so that sanctuary legacy carries us into the work that we do today. I wear a lot of different hats in my organization, but I lead our policy advocacy. And so coming into 2025, we were working really closely with the Berkeley City Council to pass a resolution reaffirming the right to sanctuary and advocate for stronger protections for immigrants in Berkeley. As we know, right now, local politics, mayors and counties are kind of on the front lines of standing up against the unlawful presence of DHS and ICE in our communities. And so we really see it as a legacy of Sanctuary to continue that advocacy. We, as a result of that organizing, developed really close relationships with the new mayor of Berkeley, and some of the city council members. And we sit on the Mayor's Sanctuary City Task Force, which is a monthly meeting of different stakeholders in Berkeley to represent the needs of the immigrant community. As a result of that organizing, we advocated for the passage of a sanctuary ordinance to really codify all of the protections for immigrants, as Berkeley has been such a progressive bulwark, but none of this was actually in the laws. And it just so happened that at the city council meeting in September, where we were advocating for the passage of this ordinance, there was also a vote on flock surveillance cameras. And so that's kind of how we started to tread into the surveillance landscape and how we really became aware of the intersections between immigration and surveillance. And so in Berkeley right now, we have 52 ALPR cameras, which are the license plate reader cameras. And the Berkeley City Council, as a result of our advocacy at that meeting, postponed a vote on flock. There were maybe 50 to 100 community members who showed up and speaking out for the rights of immigrants. I know we had the first panel that kind of talked a broad overview, but those in this room may or may not know that Flock has had a lot of various allegations about data sharing with ICE, various back and side door access that ICE and DHS have to these cameras, whether it be jurisdictions within the state of California or outside the state of California who are searching Berkeley's cameras. We found out in the middle of last year that the Berkeley's cameras had been searched 3 times by ICE and CPB. And the Berkeley police, even though they're supposed to report on that immediately, did not report that until they buried it in the surveillance technology use report. And that's actually pretty low in terms of usage. In San Francisco and in Oakland, it's much higher, the number of times that our cameras have been searched by immigration enforcement. And so the vote was postponed, and we have continued to kind of watch the space. At the Sanctuary Task Force meeting yesterday, in fact, it was announced that Berkeley will be bringing a vote back on Flock in March. for a variety of policies, new surveillance cameras being one of them. The others are the use of drones. And included in the use policy right now for drones is at mass gatherings for possible criminal activity, which we all know the federal government is trying to portray basically anyone who is defending the rights of immigrants, legal observers in this moment as, conducting criminal activity. And so there's a lot of these technologies that can be leveraged against, immigrants. And I think that that's kind of what I think this panel is here to focus on, is that it is starting with the immigrant community as they are really being vilified and being targeted in this current moment by the federal administration, but it is not exclusive to the immigrant community. This really applies to all of us and the variety of ways that these cameras can be used. And so the Berkeley City Council will be voting on a drone use policy, an integration with household cameras, so an ability for the Berkeley Police Department to look at it's on an opt-in basis that the individuals with household cameras can integrate their cameras into the Flock database, and then some other kind of use of force policies. And so we are kind of right now just on the front lines of this fight. We didn't come to this fight as surveillance experts, and so I'm not up here today as a surveillance expert, but we are really seeing this as a legacy of sanctuary organizing and what it means to create true community trust. We want our cities to be places where our community feels safe going to the hospital, using public transportation, but even patronizing local businesses, just being out and comfortable in community. And when we have cameras that are knowingly sharing this information with the federal government, and Flock is the worst case scenario. There has been obviously all of these reports about various data sharing, but it's our belief that if this data is collected, it can and will be shared with the federal government. The kind of violations of our constitutional rights to privacy right now means that we don't believe that any contractual safeguards will really prevent, the federal government from accessing this data if they want it. So we are continuing that fight in Berkeley, and we worked pretty hard in Oakland. Just to give some context for the Oakland fight, unfortunately, after the Privacy Commission voted against a Flock use policy and Flock contract, and the Public Safety Commission voted against it, the City Council still brought it to a vote. And after about 4 hours of public comment and 200 people showing up to a City Council meeting, the council still voted 7-1 in favor of the Flock contract. So it is an uphill battle, and at times it's hard to stay optimistic, but I think in this moment, we're really focusing on community education and mobilization. As everyone in this room knows, these technologies are complicated and can often be intimidating. And I think the first panel gave a good example of how it can feel challenging for an individual or a community to really fight back in any meaningful way. But we have found that our pressure can influence these spaces, and especially as immigrant rights advocates, that we have a really powerful voice with our local elected officials. So, we're pointing to examples like in Santa Cruz, the city and most recently the county voted to terminate their contracts with Flock. Jurisdictions like Richmond and Mountain View have paused their contracts with Flock. So there are examples of community pressure really succeeding, and so that's kind of where the fight lands, and we'll let you know how it goes.
Much of this debate around Flock rests on this sort of false two-way narrative of whether Flock is providing community safety measures or it is aimed at surveillance. And depending on who you talk to, especially in your role as a task force member, you might have had occasion to encounter some of this today. So tell us a little bit more about how this is being done.
Yeah, so it's being positioned in a variety of ways. There are, one, crime is down in Berkeley and Oakland. It's been trending downward for the past 4 or 5 years now. But Flock will still claim and does a lot of advocacy and has some contested studies that they reduce crime, that security and surveillance cameras reduce crime. And the police departments love to point to those studies. Also, the police really tout the integration of all of Flock's networks, which is one of our biggest concerns. And for example, with the drone use policy, the police department is actually saying that it will save the department time and energy, as they don't have to be on the ground. They can just send a drone to somehow figure out if there's a crime occurring without using facial recognition technology. You can tell we're skeptical. So that's where the debate lies. I think that there's and the council members are also hearing, from members of the community that they believe these cameras would prevent against, car break-ins, for example. But it is our belief as sanctuary organizers and advocates that policing and surveillance do not keep communities safe. It is like sanctuary politics. It's a trust in, that if you are a victim of domestic violence, you can call the police even if you have unsatisfactory immigration status, that you still can use the hospital or go to school. And so solutions, even like better street lighting or investment in youth programming. There are so many alternatives to surveillance that actually meaningfully contribute to public safety and aren't just cameras that catch crimes. Cameras don't stop crimes, they just record them. And so I think that's definitely part of the fight. And I think we're still navigating the landscape of, saying that it's Flock is the worst offender here. But there are lots of jurisdictions that will likely reject Flock and go with another surveillance vendor. And so just, the policing landscape is really open to these kind of solutions, and it's up to the community to really say that, that is not meaningful public safety to us.
So what do you see as standing in the way of this surveillance?
A good question. I mean, I think it's local jurisdictions at this point. We have a police accountability board in Berkeley that is really trying to advocate for stronger use policies. If these technologies are used, that they will still, like data retention, for example, like the data can only be saved for 30 days, or that you still need a warrant to access certain data. And so I really think that we have to rely on our local jurisdictions, and if we can't completely prevent the use of the technology, that would really limit its use, and how that, I was talking to someone yesterday, that it's one thing to have use policies, and then you also need an accountability measure to make sure that those use policies are followed. And so there are really a lot of different mechanisms in it, and it comes down to civilian oversight and community pressure that says that, and showing up to city council meetings and advocating with your various representatives. I think
that's important, and I'm sure Erin will have a lot to say about that too. But we'll take one question from the audience. Okay. So it was interesting how
Thank you. I represent Hispanic Radio, and we have reported on this exactly on the Flock cameras. And my concern is that it's not just one photo of the license plates, for example. They can actually follow you to your home or wherever you go. So they start building like the story of your life. And we don't know where this information is gonna end up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I actually, one of our attorneys shared yesterday that CHP used the flock cameras to construct a movement pattern of her client, and then based on that movement pattern, knew where she would be so that they could arrest her. And that's exactly the concern here. And you know, like police departments are allowed to do that with a warrant, and that's where the problem lies. That this is like these warrantless searches which violate our constitutional right to privacy, and these technologies enable that. And so, yeah, it is really up to us to say we have to follow the due process and the Constitution and the protections that are given to us, and not let these technologies invade that or erode that.
Thank you, Rebecca. We're moving to Supervisor Aaron Peskin. He's been inside the room where decisions get made and has pushed back on surveillance expansion from within city government. He offers a rare inside view of policymaking, especially on facial recognition tools. He authored a landmark legislation, the first of its kind, banning city departments in San Francisco from using facial recognition technology, which passed in May 2019. And here's the interesting piece of this. Jake Snow was involved in this whole process. So we have, so I'm going to hand it over to Aaron to talk about your 2019 legislation and where it is today.
Thank you, Jaya, and thanks to the original panel that I really enjoyed. I mean, I've been out of the legislative business for a little while, but I really enjoyed listening to that first panel. And the power of the media in this cannot be understated. Actually, I was first turned on to this from an LA Times reporter, Robert Shearer, who had written a book in 2016 called They Know Everything About You. And I read that on my summer vacation and then gave it to my former staff. Sarah Souza's here. We worked with another person in my office named Lee Hebner, who was interested in this stuff. I think you know Lee. And so Lee actually started casting about and realized San Francisco, we're very narcissistic. We, perpetuate this San Francisco exceptionalism, which sometimes is legitimate and sometimes is just narcissistic bullshit. So I have to preface this by saying this was not a San Francisco first. We love, we did same-sex marriage before anybody else, but no, this was not a San Francisco first. Actually, the notion that we were just talking about, use policies, was actually promulgated largely by a gentleman in the East Bay, Brian Hofer, secure justice, right? Yeah. And we were the 7th city to adopt the use, a construct where our local government had to ask itself questions and had to promulgate use policies and had to say in a public sphere very transparently how we use surveillance technology, how long we stored the data, who had access to it, who we shared it with, regardless of whether it was actually adequately enforced or not. At least that conversation was happening. And interestingly enough, by the way, this did not just apply to law enforcement. This applied to every department in city government. And surveillance technology, which you might not, and I didn't think of as surveillance technology, permeates so many aspects of our lives and our governmental lives that you don't even think about it as surveillance technology, like the little strip that is in the book that you check out from the public library, that the public library can actually track. Or departments like our water utility that has social media that they can actually track the comments. It's a form of surveillance. It's not just the license plate readers. It's not just the surveillance cameras or crime cameras, as some people, or security cameras, as some people call them. It's a whole host of technologies. And actually, many of our departments were actually very welcoming of it. They wanted to ask those questions. They asked themselves those questions. And interestingly enough, law enforcement
did not oppose the legislation. There was a San Francisco first. The San Francisco first was that it banned, not in the general public, just for city acquisition and use of surveillance technology that used facial recognition technology. We banned that. We banned it for a number of reasons. We banned it because, by the way, these algorithms reflect the biases of the programmers who create them, who tend to overwhelmingly be white men. So guess what? Facial recognition technology disproportionately misidentified people of color because the algorithm was created by white dudes. This is true. As a matter of fact, it misidentified about 25% of the members of Congress, most of them people of color, I kid you not. So we banned that. And we said, hey, this thing is not ready for prime time, but we also recognize that it would never be ready for prime time relative to the privacy and civil liberties that we're trying to protect. There's a dynamic tension in our society that as a lawmaker and a decision maker, we have to think about and balance. And it is, on the one hand, wanting to have a safe society, right? And on the other hand, safeguarding our rights, our constitutional rights, our civil rights, in an atmosphere where irresponsible people, many of them with financial incentives, be they the Peter Thiels of Palantir or demagogic politicians, like to trade in the politics of fear because it's extremely effective. And so, I mean, that's the kind, and by the way, my legislation, which passed the Board of Supervisors, I believe on a 10-to-1 vote, was subsequently watered down, because somebody brought this up during the break, by a ballot measure that the mayor put on the ballot, which basically said that drone policies never had to go through this internal accounting, this use policy, this public, as well as police department surveillance cameras would not have to go through it either. My argument, the mayor's argument was, oh, the board could turn it down. True, the board could turn it down. That's what my 19B of the administrative code said, was we could turn it down. In matter of fact, we never turned it down. We approved over 100 different surveillance technologies. We did not turn down one. Now, I'm very proud of the fact that we had some very interesting conversations with departments, like, for instance, the airport brought us a surveillance technology policy, and they said that they shared data in an incident of a crime within the airport with certain agencies, and they shared it with law enforcement, and they shared it with the district attorney. And I said, well, how come you don't share it with the public defender? Public defender might want to use it to exonerate a client. And they said, oh, hey, good point. We're going to amend our policy to include the public defender. So we had these conversations. A lot of it was just about educating people, collectively stepping up the game. So we never turned one down, but it was very important because people like the ACLU and people like Juan, who, you know, have backgrounds in technology, could show up as members of the public, as experts, as concerned citizens, and up our game collectively. You know, I think things are always better when they're transparent. I also think that local government has a huge role to play. My hometown, where I was born and raised in Berkeley, was the first sanctuary city. San Francisco was not far behind. And what did we learn from Sanctuary City? We learned that it made communities safer. We actually learned that it made communities safer, and that having that level of transparency meant that people were actually willing to go to law enforcement. And what's happening now in America, which every local government has to resist, is that we have to lead the way with transparency locally in order to create secure communities, not just through traditional law enforcement, but through policies like Sanctuary City that are now under attack. And the best way to do that is to create local policies. I'll tell you another story. It's kind of a surveillance story, very, very different, which is that we realized a couple of years ago that a major technology company out of Texas, a company called RealPage, was selling a software to apartment owners, major corporate apartment owners around the United States of America, that they were using to collude, to monopolize and artificially raise rents. In the old days, you know, a bunch of guys from Chevron and Exxon and Standard Oil would go in the back room, smoke some cigars, and agree that they were going to artificially set the price of gas at $2 a gallon or whatever. Nowadays, you do that on the internet. And guess what? We passed a law and introduced a law that said it is illegal to use that software in San Francisco. I mean, how can I enforce it? Good question. Maybe hard to enforce. But now it's been adopted by numerous states in the United States of America. So having that, taking that local initiative, at least up until what happens is then, you know, the Elon Musks and Thiels and whatever go to the United States Congress that they pretty much own, and they get them to preempt local laws and state laws. But even going through that process gives us some hope. So, you know, I'm all for use what you got, which is local control, use it everywhere you can, often as you can. So that's kind of my route.
Yeah, I'm just going to kind of dig deeper into this idea of local laws being created and to prevent data from being shared, and what guardrails are there for legislators to prevent this data from actually being shared. I mean, we do have Mountain View saying that they're not going to use Flock or pausing their use of Flock, but if it's not Flock, they might sign up with another third-party vendor. I don't see, you know, even another third-party vendor could have an agreement with Palantir or any other organization. So where do you think this this conversation must go in order to, or you know, what is the role of legislation in this?
Chapter 19B of our administrative code, which is this surveillance ordinance, is fundamentally tied to funding the acquisition and use of surveillance technology. So the ultimate piece of leverage that the government has is that it can cut off funding and say, all right, Flock, we adopted a policy that says our information can't be shared with third parties, and we now have evidence that you're sharing with third parties. We're getting rid of the technology. So that the fundamental, that hasn't happened yet, but that is, and it's also, by the way, very hard to figure out whether they're doing it. We did, by the way, figure out that our police department was using, through third parties, facial recognition technology, and they admitted it. And they said, hey, one person totally didn't get the memo, and he's now done it 3 times, and they documented it. And we said, okay, you've said it. Thank you for being honest. We don't want to see that again, or we're going to take away, you know, some of your technology. But I mean, so at least that interaction happened. But it's very difficult because you've got A, you got to figure it out, and then B, you've got to have the political fortitude to take something away, and you get great political. I mean, you know, there's great political pressure from conservative elements that you've just got to have the wherewithal to stick up, stand up to.
Well, okay, we'll take one question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Peskin. I'm with India Currents as a reporter, but I'm also a member of the Sunshine Task Force of SFCD. And the question I have for you is, we have gotten so many cases of the public requesting the SFPD or the SFMTA to give data about the cameras that have been set up in the city for the red light and for the speed safety that they've been called life-saving technology by the MTA, if I quote them correctly. But every time we get this case in the task force, the police department or the MTA, from whom the records are requested from, they keep citing attorney-client privilege or PII or public safety when they say we can't give this data on where the cameras are placed in the city. They say that, we do know that public surveillance is happening through these cameras, but this data, all the people want is they want to know where the cameras are placed. They want a map. They want to know exactly where the cameras are for their own safety, but that data is not being given. So that makes me wonder, as a member of the task force, are we under constant surveillance even when we're at the traffic signal? Like, it makes me very scared to even drive at this point.
So the San Francisco has flock cameras and they have data on you. We know where those flock cameras are. That is actually public information. San Francisco recently got permission from the state 2 years ago to put in speed cameras, of which there are 33. All of them are public information. And then going way back, we've had red light cameras, and the placement of where they are is all public information. Interestingly enough, because of privacy concerns, you can't get information as to any individual that ran a red light, but you can get anonymized data as to how many red light tickets they have put out. But the locations are not secret, to my knowledge, or at least they weren't when I left the government 2 years ago.
I'm sorry, we'll have to move on and we'll come back to these questions at the end.
And just I can talk to you about it.
So moving to our next panelist, Jake Snow. What is, so you've been at ACLU for a while now. So what do you see as the most important role of ACLU lawsuits to address surveillance?
So yeah, I've been at the ACLU for about 8 years. And I remember early on actually going to the first meeting with Supervisor Peskin with a colleague and suggesting the notion of a surveillance ordinance and a facial recognition ban. And Supervisor Peskin used an expletive and said yes. And I know. And so yeah, just it was great thinking back on that experience. Yeah, Supervisor Peskin has been a powerful ally and an advocate against surveillance technology in cities. So for the ACLU, we work both in lawsuits, filing litigation, and also with local and state and federal policymakers. And I think the best way for that work to happen is in a way that is integrated, where sometimes the right solution to a problem, for example, in San Francisco, is a municipal ordinance. Sometimes it's a state law. We work to pass a prohibition on the use of facial recognition on body-worn cameras by police. There's a moratorium passed, and we worked on that law at the state level. Obviously right now there's not a lot of anti-surveillance work happening at the federal level, but one day we hope that will return. But to me, the important role that we play as the ACLU when it comes to laws that are already on the books is being able to bring some technical and policy expertise to understanding when something is happening that's against the law, and then being able to bring a lawsuit, often with partners, to stop that violation from happening. And just thinking back to Rebecca's comments about the flock cameras, the state, and how that's a violation of constitutional rights. We recently filed a lawsuit against the city of San Jose, which has, I think, over 400 cameras throughout that city. They retain the license plate information that essentially tracks everyone who drives around San Jose everywhere they go for up to a year. And so, you can just go back in time and see where someone was a year ago, see where they went to work, when they picked their kids up at school, what activities they went to, what potentially what medical appointments. And that level of granular data about the sort of rhythm of people's daily lives is fundamentally dangerous in the hands of cities. And, a lot of us would like to think that places like San Francisco or Berkeley or San Jose or Santa Clara, California overall, can do a good job of protecting that information because we have a state sanctuary law, we have city and county sanctuary rules. And I think sometimes that protection happens, but there is a law that says that that local law enforcement cannot share license plate data with the federal government. It's SB 34, and we have documented that law being violated scores of times. We sent a letter to 70 different city police departments laying out how their systems were violating state law. Eventually, we filed a lawsuit called Lagleva against the County of Marin, I believe, and then the Attorney General of California released guidance to cities. This is a while ago, saying that sharing with federal law enforcement was a violation of that law, and yet the violations continued. Even today, cities are continuing to reveal that they have been sharing information with immigration enforcement on an ongoing basis or in individual cases. And I think this just goes to show that, people like to say all politics is local. Well, all surveillance is global. Like, you can't take that information and just have it be kept in a community among people who have that community trust in Rebecca's powerful phrase. And so that means that these kinds of systems need to be built and deployed, if they are deployed at all, with an understanding that that information is often only, it is only safe if it is not collected at all. And so, especially in a time of rising or, authoritarianism, and all of us facing a repressive and violent government that is hunting people on the streets, the cities and counties in California and around the country who hold that information have to understand that that information can and will be used in ways that the people in those places do not want, would not accept. And so those are some examples of how the ACLU is engaged with this. And I think it is a helpful direction for understanding how all of us can kind of look back at the policies that are in place and think about how they maybe need to be changed in light of the world we see before us.
And I think Supervisor Peskin alluded to this, but the facial recognition software and the documented harms, you did a very interesting experiment on it. So tell us about it.
Sure. So back in 2018, there was, we revealed for the first time the fact that Amazon had, as part of its cloud service, been selling facial recognition technology to law enforcement. It was a police department in Oregon and a sheriff's office in Florida. And we revealed that they were selling the facial recognition to law enforcement. And after we revealed that, and there was a lot of concern over the fact that, it seems kind of naive at the time. At the time, and Amazon was thought of as being like a friendly internet storefront. I think people have a different perspective on that company now for good reason. But at the time, we brought light to the fact that they were selling this technology to law enforcement. And then working with colleagues, I worked with folks at ACLU NorCal to do a test of Amazon's technology. What we did is we gathered a public set of around 20,000 public mugshots off the internet, people who had been in contact with law enforcement for some reason. And then we collected all of the photos of the current members of Congress in 2018 and compared those members of Congress to the public mugshots that we gathered. And it turned out that 26 members of Congress had falsely matched with a mugshot. All of those, to be clear, were false matches. And there were disproportionately people of color in those false matches. Like, I think 6 members of the Congressional Black Caucus were present in those false matches, including the late, great civil rights icon, John Lewis. And in the wake of releasing that test, John Lewis sent a letter to Jeff Bezos saying, like, we need to talk about the civil rights implications of your technology. I think that conversation is still necessary. I don't know that it's happened in a way that's satisfactory, but it was an important, I think, moment in lifting up, thinking back to the previous panel, how Jake Ward was talking about the dangers if it's wrong. I think those are the dangers if it's wrong. And now we're starting to see the dangers if it is right. If you can find somebody in a medical clinic who's seeking an abortion, who's an undocumented person trying to go about their daily lives. And so the dangers are both when it's flawed and when it works.
And what are our existing Fourth Amendment protections equipped to handle the kind of data aggregation we're seeing?
I think that remains to be seen. Oh,
Don't worry about it. I'm good. I'm good.
So the one thing that
That's fine. I'm fine.
okay, I don't want to. Okay, great. I'm looking forward to Tim's comments as well. So recently we've seen some attempts by the Department of Homeland Security to target people who are speaking out against immigration enforcement online. In September of last year, we got an inquiry from somebody who received a notice from Meta saying that the government had requested that Meta hand over the personal information of this person who ran an activist anonymous Instagram account in Southern California. And effectively what Meta was being asked to do is through the use of what's called an administrative subpoena, which is basically a legal process that a judge has never seen, to hand over, to unmask people who are speaking out against ICE. All this person and their account had done was to repost a video criticizing a Border Patrol agent who was active in the violent and racist immigration raids in Los Angeles. The notice from Meta said, you have 10 days to go to court, file a motion, or we will turn over your identity to the Department of Homeland Security. At this point, and it's still true, the Department of Homeland Security has said that recording members of law enforcement as they do their duties, which by the way is fully protected by the First Amendment, is tantamount to violence. It is, they said, a threat to officer safety. And so this person was facing down the idea that immigration enforcement would consider them a violent threat to law enforcement and would show up at their door, show up at their family's door, persecute them, harm them, harm their community. They were, in a word, absolutely terrified. So we filed a motion in federal court to stop Meta from handing that over. We got a judge to order Meta immediately after the day after we filed our motion to say, like, Meta may not hand this information over. And then after that happened, a few weeks passed, but the Department of Homeland Security withdrew subpoena. This has actually happened in 3 cases now, where the Department of Homeland Security has used these administrative subpoenas, and then when challenged, and we've actually filed all of these cases in San Francisco, they have withdrawn the subpoena after some amount of time. And to me, what that indicates is they are trying to push out these subpoenas to unmask people, and then when they are challenged, they give them up so they don't have to face any accountability, and they don't have to face the possibility of a court order stating that what they've done is illegal. And so that's another aspect of what we've done to protect people's rights.
Oh, fascinating. And we can come back to that, but let's move to Tim. Tim Redmond, we'll come back to the question at the end.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Tim, all yours.
Oh, okay, thanks. Well, first of all, I'm a reporter and I'm a journalist. I'm here basically to talk about some of the things that are going on now in San Francisco and some of the stories that come out of that we all, as journalists, I know there's a lot of journalists in the room, ought to be following. Right. And obviously one of the first things is this trade-off that everyone's been talking about between, public safety and being spied on. Surveillance is being spied on. A former member of the Board of Supervisors who was not sitting in this room, one point when there was previous legislation around this, said to me, I don't think he'd want to be quoted on this, but he said to me, if we put metal detectors all along Market Street and every single block, everyone who walked on Market Street had to go through a metal detector and then submit to a full body search, we'd get some contraband. We'd find some illegal guns. We'd find some fentanyl. We'd find some contraband. We absolutely would. And would that make any of us feel safer? The idea that you can't walk a single block down Market Street without having to go through a metal detector and have your entire body searched? No, right? So there's a certain point where the government's surveillance becomes intrusive and undermines public safety, particularly in a time right now when one of the greatest threats to public safety in San Francisco is the federal government and is the information they have. So we've talked about, and I missed the earlier panel because I was teaching a class, but one of the things that strikes me is the confluence of all of these technologies. The New York Times did a story like 2 years ago where they basically bought a bunch of cell phone data. And they bought enough cell phone data that they were able to track the movements of tens of thousands of people around New York City. And because they could mix that with other data, that they, for example, found a person who lived in one neighborhood and taught at a school 14 miles away, and every morning left at 7:30 and traveled to school, and then afterwards went various places. They contacted her and she said, yes, you can use my name. This is horrible, but you were able to find out about me. And they tracked that she went from school to her boyfriend's house and then to Planned Parenthood the next morning, and various things that you do not want anyone to know about, right? The New York Times was able to buy this, I'm gonna come back to this in a second, from a private company, right? So take that and put the flock cameras on top of that. Right? And now they really know where everybody is all the time, if they want to, right? Now, this is obviously scary. And there are obviously ways that we can try to put limits on this. One of the things that Aaron Peskin's bill did that I think was really important is that it includes what's called a private right of action. What this means is, okay, so the cops aren't supposed to be spying on people. They're not supposed to be using facial recognition technology. What if they do it anyway? And frankly, around 2021 or 2022, they stopped responding to supervisors' requests for information. They just stopped giving that information out. But let's just say that they do. What are we supposed to do about it? Well, the city attorney could investigate, but the city attorney defends the police department. The district attorney could investigate because it is a crime, but the district attorney never investigates the police department. We had a district attorney who tried and they recalled him, right? Because he was investigating the police department. So what do? Well, Supervisor Peskin's bill says a private entity, someone like the ACLU, has the right to sue if we believe that this is being violated. And at one point, Secure Justice, who we were talking about earlier, did sue the city. And they found out that the SFPD had outsourced its surveillance to the Daly City cops and something called the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center, which is a mixture of state and federal agencies. Yeah, so they had basically, well, how did we find this out? Private lawsuit. Right? A group like the ACLU, this case was Secure Justice, sued to say the cops aren't following the law. Okay, the reason I'm telling you this is Supervisor Matt Dorsey, who was a former chief information officer for the San Francisco Police Department, has introduced legislation to repeal that part of Supervisor Peskin's bill. That legislation is pending, and we should all be following it. It has not yet been called for a committee hearing. But what Supervisor Dorsey says is, this is just expensive harassment suits against the cops. Now, like tracking, there have been about $70 million worth of lawsuit settlements against the SFPD in the last 10 years, 12 years. I don't remember where I cut off on my research in this. The vast majority of them were use of excess force. Were cops shooting somebody, beating somebody up, right? And that's what those lawsuits are about. This is not a harassment against the police thing. This hasn't happened very often. There's been one of them so far, but it did send a message, right? That if you do this and the DA is not going to do anything and the city attorney is not going to do anything, the ACLU might come in and sue you and force you to stop it, right? So that bill, if Supervisor Dorsey is successful in getting that passed, would undermine a significant amount of the local control that we've had on this. Again, that bill he announced he was introducing it about 4 months ago. It has not yet been scheduled for a committee hearing. I will be following it closely. And I think all of you should too, because that's a very big deal. And I'm going to guess, and Aaron, you can contradict me if you think, but I'm going to guess that right now there's 7 votes in favor of that Dorsey bill. Right now, I would say 7 members of the Board of Supervisors will vote to undermine this in the name of public safety. And whenever I hear about public safety, I think, well, wait a minute, what about public safety for the members of the public who have good reason to fear federal authorities? What about their public safety? And what about the fact that, yeah, we could collect a lot of guns and knives if we put up metal detectors all up and down Market Street, but we clearly don't want to do that, right? Something else that I think we should be talking about. The city now has a spy agency called the Real-Time Investigation Center, right? This is an agency that uses surveillance to track crimes, quote, in real time. This is why they love drones, so they can fly around the city, maybe fly around demonstrations, look to see if they can find any crime happening in real time, right? So where is this Real-Time Investigation Center? Is it at police headquarters down in Mission Bay? No, it's at the headquarters of Ripple, a cryptocurrency outfit run by Chris Larson. Chris Larson has donated office space to the city and county of San Francisco to let them run their spy agency out of his offices. Tim's telling you the truth, by the way.
I didn't make this up. Yeah, this actually happened. $9.4 million. The Board of Supervisors accepted $9.4 million of in-kind contributions from Chris Larson for office space for the Real-Time Investigation Center. Now, there's a couple of things about this. One, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to do stories about the tech industry, but you can't go into tech headquarters to do a story. In fact, the few times that I've been allowed into tech headquarters, you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement to say you won't even say what's on the walls. Right? And then you are escorted around by security agents. You can't even go to the bathroom alone. Right? These folks are obsessed with security because who knows, I might be smart enough to steal some crypto secrets from Chris Larson. I'm not. Right? But the public has no oversight of this. You can't go in and look at it. Right? You can go into the Mission Police Station and you can talk to the people there. Right? You can follow the cops when they're driving around the mission. You can video police actions. Right? That's all First Amendment protected. You can't have. We have no clue. And I bet even members of the Board of Supervisors would not be allowed into that center without signing non-disclosure agreements and being followed around by security guards and being told they can't take pictures. Okay? So we have no idea what's going on in there. That's a story, right? That is something that as journalists, we ought to be really concerned about because we don't know what they're doing. Okay, now, the third element of this is, what do you say?
I was just mentioning to Rebecca that Chris Larson was the second largest donor to Donald Trump's inauguration.
Yes, right. He has also been a big supporter of police agencies and a big supporter of, he will be a big supporter of Matt Dorsey's bill to undermine this. Okay, so this is about, on one level, the privatization of information, right? The Flock is a private company. Flock is not under the control of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors or the California legislature. It's a private company, right? The New York Times got all of that cell phone data by buying from a private company that collects that data. The cell phone companies sell that data to other data vendors. Some of this is a little legally hazy. Some of this is kind of dark web kind of stuff, but there are private companies that are data brokers that sell this kind of data. You all remember the Cambridge Analytica scandal, right? This stuff is out there and Flock is collecting data. And I'm telling you, they decide whether to respond to an administrator subpoena or a judge's subpoena or a request from Homeland Security. Just we're talking about other companies where these things have come in with, they decide whether to do that. That's not up to Supervisor Mary Peskin or the mayor of San Francisco or the governor of California. Right? So Chris Larson owns the pipes, the internet lines that this stuff is going in and out on. All right. Can he track what the Real-Time Information Center is doing? If he can't, he's not trying very hard. Right? I mean, these tech places, if Chris Larson, a private supporter of Donald Trump and a friend of federal authorities, is not able to track what they're doing at the Real-Time Information Center, it's because he hasn't tried. Do we trust that? Do we trust any of this? You know, a lot of people don't trust the government. When I was growing up, the government was somebody who was going to send you to die in Vietnam and put you in jail for smoking pot. And a lot of my friends say, I don't trust those guys. I trust the private sector a whole lot less. Okay. I trust the privatization of information a whole lot less. At least with the government, we can go to the Board of Supervisors meeting and we can say, Supervisor Peskin, what the hell are you doing? And we can watch it, right? I've done that before. He knows that. we can watch. We can pay attention. You're not doing that at Ripple Labs. You're not doing that with Chris Larson. You're not doing that with Flock. You're not doing it with any of these outside vendors. So that's another element that I think as journalists, we need to really be careful about and looking at is the private sector control of so much information about us and how they can use that. Now, you know, some of it is just marketing, right? Obviously, Google, Amazon, all these people, they track everything that we do so they can sell us stuff. Right? When my mother was in ill health before she died, I went online and researched those little life things that you put around your neck. And if you fall down in the shower, you can hit a button and it calls one of your family members. Okay, so I spent 15 minutes trying to find one. I bought one, sent it to her. 2 days later, I start getting ads on Google for crematoriums. Someone in your family is going to die soon. Here's how to get them cremated. Right? So they do creepy, tracking stuff to sell me stuff. Right? I don't particularly like them, but I don't particularly care. I can ignore those ads, no big deal, all right? But when it's tracking that information so that they can come and arrest you in the middle of the night is a whole different thing. And when it's private companies doing that, it's very difficult to have accountability over them. And that is why it's so important, for example, that these bills allow for a private right of action. So watch Supervisor Dorsey's bill. Pay attention to Chris Larson controlling this stuff privately, the private data brokers, and think about how we as a society need to control and regulate these. So that's just a few journalistic ideas that I have for you.
Wow.
It's wonderful how you connected all the dots.
You know, I have to ask one question, and this was the original question that motivated today's briefing. San Francisco Mayor Lurie had a phone conversation with Trump, and there were 2, maybe 3 tech bros on that call. How come we didn't wind up getting an ICE surge the way Minneapolis did? And did it have anything to do, and Supervisor Peskin would love to know your thoughts on where the Lurie administration is now with guardrails for surveillance on data sharing, but we don't even know what happened on that conversation. So a lot of this was sparked by an Asian colleague who said to me, can you find out why it was San Francisco didn't get an ICE surge, and did it have to do with data? That's an intriguing question. And honestly, that was the start of my concern about what do I know about surveillance technology anyway. We never were able to pin anything down, and I wouldn't want to even suggest that there were agreements that had anything to do with data sharing. It may have just been, we're not sure what it was. But the fact is, I realized all of us are kind of giving the government the benefit of the doubt. And maybe we can't afford to do that around this whole area of data sharing. I didn't mean to hijack the moderating, but I did want to say that this concern over how San Francisco managed to avoid the fate of Minneapolis, or Phoenix for that matter, or we are led to believe maybe San Diego will be next. How did we stay safe? And is there any way in which our kind of central role in AI tech bro culture were the capital of the folks that produce surveillance technology? Is there any connection?
I think you're answering your own question in many ways. I don't know what happened on that call, and I can, weave all sorts of assumptions. I certainly would assume that Donald Trump and the administration behind him that are highly transactional do not give anything away without getting something in return. We can think about what those things are. I do think that there were some very influential people who, it's been reported, included Benioff and included others. I think what's more helpful for us is to actually understand the outsized role and outsized responsibility that San Francisco, Northern California, and the Bay Area have in the advent of these technologies and our complicity as San Franciscans and Bay Area people. So as I say in your business, and in my former business, follow the money. This is all about money. Yes, yes, our civil rights are being violated along the way, but it's all about making very, very rich, powerful people even richer and more powerful. And I mean, and yeah, then they get into all this weird shit about wanting to live forever and other stuff. But I mean, the bottom line is Mr. Benioff, who called for the National Guard to come to San Francisco until he realized it might be bad for business because everybody got pissed at him. This guy is making money off of optimizing ISIS operations. This is a fact. So did he have an outsized influence with Donald Trump? Yeah, he did. There's a guy like Chris Larson, who, by the way, was up to his eyeball in FEC investigations under the Biden administration. $5 million contribution to the inauguration of Donald Trump. And all of his FEC lawsuits went away and got settled, right? So, I mean, that's, I think, what is to look at. You know, I would imagine, but this is total made up of whole cloth speculation on my part, that what the technologists and the billionaire oligarchs are giving Trump and the administration is information and access to information. And that's happening anyway, but it's just, you know, smoother. That's my guess.
Great. Oh, that really helps. We have run out of time, John. Okay. We have questions. If people can stay, and then we've asked Deepak at the end to share his innovative technology for protecting people. But let's take the questions. Jaya, go ahead. Peter.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll make it quick. So the first is, have there been any polls, surveys to show where the public stands in terms of this question of privacy and surveillance? You know, it's so easy to manipulate people and scare them through public safety and things like that. So I'm just curious where San Francisco, where California stands in terms of this question of surveillance. The second question I'm going to ask on behalf of a colleague of mine who's not here today. She is a Venezuelan immigrant. She told me that she learned recently that when she goes to see her doctor and they use translation software, that the translations are recorded and then sent off to and shared, despite the fact that doctors say that this conversation is private. I don't know if this is a question for Mr. Snow at the ACLU. Are you familiar with this? What should people know about their interactions, particularly immigrants who don't speak English and require interpretation services with their doctors? How safe should they feel about these conversations being private?
So just to answer both those quickly. So as for polling on people's attitudes around privacy and surveillance, you know, there's going to be a lot of polling that says a lot of different things. And I think, you know, people who want to do public opinion research to support notions like, you know, undermining surveillance law or violating people's privacy will have polls that they can say, oh, we want more public safety. But there are also a lot of polls, and we did some polling quite a while ago now, 4 or 5 years ago at the ACLU, asking people about their attitudes around consumer privacy and whether they wanted like strong privacy protective defaults. Like, do you want companies to ask you before sharing or selling your personal information? Things like that. And people, you know, by like up over like 90%, people said yes. So like when you phrase things in a way of saying like, do you want ownership, agency, and control of your personal information and information about you? People definitely want that. And I mean, that's also borne out in like the practical experience of people using their phones. Like all of us may remember, if you have an iPhone, that there was a time a few years ago where Apple put up a dialogue, and you still see it now, where it will say, like, do you want to allow this app to track your activity across websites? And when you see that, and that's honestly just tells you exactly what's going on and what your choice is, disproportionately people vastly say, no, I don't want app to track me across websites. What possible benefit that offers me? So I think that's no service in here. Revealed preference, if you will, of people's desires. As for people's confidentiality with their doctors, you know, there are a lot of specific privacy laws, HIPAA and such, that govern people's health records, and then also people's conversations with their psychiatrists or their doctors. You know, I think that with the like use of these kinds of tools, transcription tools and such inside of the practice of medicine, like there may be ways that those laws are not like properly protecting people's privacy. But unfortunately, I think the way to address that is to try to say no in the moment. And then also to like bring light to this particular instance of privacy violation. And then maybe there can be something that's done at a policy level.
Anita?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, maybe a fairly basic question, but is there a racial profiling aspect as to where these flock cameras are placed? Are there, say, for example, more cameras in the Mission than there might be in North Valley?
I honestly don't know. I don't know. I know that the recent deployment of speed cameras, different than flock cameras, were done based on where they were geographically distributed, 3 per supervisorial district, and targeted to high entry corridors. But I don't know about flock cameras. We could find out.
Rebecca might have an answer. Yeah, I was gonna.
Yeah, just in Berkeley specifically, the camera, the new camera locations that they're going to be voting on soon are based off of like high traffic business corridors, which happen to be urban areas where there are, you know, more unhoused populations and there are more people of color versus like the hills of Berkeley where predominantly like more of affluent white communities live. So we can make our own conclusions based off of that. They say it's high traffic business corridors that they're aiming these cameras at.
Just to know, as I was driving to the city, when you're on Google Maps, it tells you where they are. Oh, really? You didn't know that?
It tells you, it doesn't tell you where the flock cameras are. Your Google Maps tell you where the red light cameras are and where the speed cameras.
There is an open source website called deflock.me, which you can see, and people can community, like when you locate a flock camera on walking in your day-to-day life, you can tag it. And so people are kind of contributing to that information. Deflock me. Let me make sure. Here's one question.
This one question. It's to Mr. Aaron. Yes, when you talk about the 2024 algorithm banning for real page, and I'm glad that San Francisco was the first one that started the banning for the algorithm. Woohoo! So I would like to know, how are we setting up this accountability? Because you know these landlords are still using real page and it's still rising the rent using the software. So where do we go to make sure they are accountable? Do you go to the tax collector? Do you go to to a private lawyer, or are we SOL?
So I did include in that legislation the same thing that Tim was talking about, which was a right of private action, private right of action, which is you can go get your own lawyer. The city attorney can sue if the city attorney wants to sue. The city attorney chooses not to. You or your attorney can sue. The problem is it's very, very difficult to prove that they are using it. What RealPage did was they actually changed their website, and for San Francisco property owners, they have an opt-out button. So they can now, and the opt-out button says that they are not, basically not sharing private information and colluding. Now, whether people are checking that button or not, we have no way of seeing. So unless somebody is like like some of the information we got from people who actually came to me, found me, sent me an email, found my phone number, who worked for some of these companies, local property managers who said, hey, you should know that this is going on. But without that, it's very hard to crack that code.
Your advice to people and I think you put that as a solution actually for this. So
Thank you, Sandy. I will be very brief. Just so you know, I'm an engineer. I worked in Silicon Valley. I'm guilty. I was at Oracle and Netscape for about over 10 years. And in 2016, my wife and I started our own non-for-profit. It's called Democracy Labs. It's based in San Francisco. I want to share 3 things with you. Number one, in terms of security, monitoring, and privacy, any app, many people may not know this, when you download an app, whether it's WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, your security is compromised because downloading the app requires a phone number. And when someone knows your phone number, they may not know what you're saying, but they know your location, your movements, and who you're talking to. So be very, very careful when you're downloading an app or sharing your phone number with anyone. The second thing I want to share is we were contacted, like imagine a hypothetical scenario where there's a danger in a community. It could be a fire, could be a flood, could be a shooting, could be something else. How do you alert the people in that community that there's an imminent danger without compromising their security and privacy? Scenario, I'll repeat. You need to warn the people in Fremont that there's a fire happening. Get out of there right away, or be careful, or do whatever. So you want to alert people about an imminent danger without compromising their security. What that means is, I do not need to know your phone number. I do not want you to download an app. I do not want you to share anything about you with me. So we developed a solution which is free. It's called fastalert.now. I'll repeat, fastalert.now. And since you're all in the media business, the best way to visualize this is imagine a radio station. You can set up your own radio station in about 15 minutes. And on that radio station, it's all on the internet, but I'm using the radio station as an analogy. You can have as many channels as you want. Fremont, Palo Alto, Hispanic farmers in Contra Costa, whatever. People tune into the channel and opt in on their own. They do not register, just like who's listening to my radio station. I have no idea. I'm broadcasting. And you can broadcast to any specific group. They get the alert on their phone, on their laptop, or their tablet right away. It'll go, bzzz, you have a message. But it is not a text message. So, for instance, if you need to alert 5,000 people in Berkeley, there's a shooting happening, be careful. It does not cost you a nickel. Right? So keep that in mind. I won't get into the details, but you can look it up online. The other thing, since you're all in the media business, something to know about is recently TikTok banned mentions of the word Epstein. And you can Google it. Meta banned any mentions of Track APAC. Mark Andreessen owns a good chunk of Substack. So think of it this way. If you rely on one of these platforms to get your message out, and if the people who own that platform don't want that message going out, how are you going to reach your audience? So one of the things which I was sharing with Sandy and Jaya is do what you have to do, but as a backup, you can create your own channels. This is the Filipino news channel. Set it up, invite people to opt into it, free of charge. And then when you send off a message, they'll get it and you're not beholden to any of the platforms. The final thing I'll mention is it now has the ability to think of a call-in radio. So you've created a channel for students in Berkeley, say, and you're sending them messages, but you say, hey guys, if you have something to share with other people on this channel, you can call in anonymously and spread that message. The platform is free. You can have any number of subscribers, any number of channels. If you have any technical questions or need help setting it up, happy to help. The The name of the website is fastalert.now. The name of the non-for-profit we have is Democracy Labs. It's called demlabs.org. We obviously do not promote any kind of violence or anything like that. We are a messaging platform. So think of Section 230. And anyway, if we can be helpful, happy to do it. Thank you, Sandy.
We move down to two panelists, so I'll just take this opportunity to thank both of you, Jake and Rebecca. Anybody want to?
Thank you so much for this remarkable session.